This is the Protestant Libertarian Podcast, a project of the Libertarian Christian Institute and part of the Christians for Liberty Network. I really hope that you guys enjoy today's show. All right, guys, welcome to another episode of the Protestant Libertarian Podcast. Great to have you guys on the show today. We're going to be talking about a book called Jesus and the Rise of Nationalism, a new quest for the 19th century historical Jesus by a New Testament scholar named Halvor Moxnes. This book was written in 2012, but there is a lot of information in this book that I think is very relevant to our show, and that is also relevant for the way that we think about both the historical Jesus and how we understand him, and then also the political consequences that we can draw from our interpretations of the historical Jesus. It's an excellent book, and I really wanted to make sure that you guys had an opportunity to engage with his ideas. Now, I know that this is a very much an old school Protestant Libertarian Podcast kind of episode, but I've been doing a few more of these lately where I'm going to be reading pretty heavily from his book today. The reason why I'm doing that is I feel like by actually quoting the author himself, I can present his very nuanced arguments in a way that is much easier for you, my audience, to understand. And this book, I don't think it's still in print. You can get a copy of it on Amazon, but it's kind of expensive. I think I spent like $40 on this book, but it's very, very important. And what's interesting is he has a really brilliant analysis of the way in which the formation of the discipline of biblical studies in the 19th century was shaped by the concurrent development of nationalism in Europe at that time. So there's this synthesis between the production of the historical Jesus in the 19th century and the rise of nationalism. And Jesus was understood by some of the most influential New Testament scholars of that time period in nationalistic terms. And that colored their understanding of who Jesus was and of his historical context. So it's a really, really, really important book. And he is going to argue, again, that all of these nationalist ideals and all of these nationalist idolatries, all of these nationalist ideologies, maybe idolatries too, were read back into the Gospels by these scholars. So in a lot of ways, Moxnes is going to take the insights of Albert Schweitzer. Remember that Albert Schweitzer, we've talked about his work, The Quest for the Historical Jesus, a lot on the show. It was published at the very beginning of the 20th century, and his conclusion was that the quest for the historical Jesus had been a giant failure because all of these scholars had just wound up reconstructing Jesus in their own image. And so in his book, The Quest for the Historical Jesus, he shows how these interpretations of Jesus as a historical figure were based on the social and political context of these scholars. Moxnes is going to do the exact same thing, except he's going to place them specifically within the context of the development of nationalism during that time. Now, before I had found this book, I did not know who Halvor Moxnes was. Apparently, he's actually published quite a bit. So I'm going to read real quick his bio here. It says Halvor Moxnes is professor of New Testament, Faculty of Theology at the University of Oslo, I guess in Sweden. He is an active member of both the Society of Biblical Literature and the Catholic Biblical Association of America. He is a member of the Norwegian Academy of Sciences and Humanities and the author of books such as Putting Jesus in His Place, Jesus and the Rise of Nationalism, and A Short History of the New Testament. So this book is very dense. He has a lot of complicated arguments that he makes in this book, but obviously a lot of very important ideas are presented as well. So I'm going to get into some of his main arguments, and he is going to take a look at four very famous and influential New Testament scholars from the 19th century and show how they were influenced by the rise of nationalism in that period. And so what he is going to argue at the beginning of his book is that the 19th century sees both the rise of these nationalist movements, a new form of nationalism, a kind of nationalism that was foreign to the world before the Enlightenment, and also the rise of the historical Jesus studies. And as I said before, the burden of Moxnes' book is to show how historical Jesus studies were both influenced by and created interpretations of Jesus which were rooted in nationalist ideology. So it's the confluence of these two processes meant that Jesus and early Christianity became identified with national identities and then also Western colonialism and imperialism. So all of these things that are happening at that time in the 19th century are going to shape the way that these scholars think about the historical Jesus. The other major issue here that he's going to address is that the conception that nations were a given and nationalism was a category that could easily be projected back into history is fundamental to all of these scholars. And there are a ton of social changes that happened during this time, such as industrialization, colonization, technological change, the diminishing power of established churches and monarchs, and all of these various social dislocations and changes are projected back into history. And so these scholars are going to make Jesus address the problems that these scholars were facing in the 19th century. And the reason why this is so important, and I got into this a little bit on my episode entitled The Socialist Roots of Modern Biblical Studies, the reason why this is so important is because in the 19th century, we have the foundation of all modern biblical scholarship, and the categories within which a lot of biblical scholars operate are still rooted in 19th century ideals, which makes it almost impossible for us to transcend that historical context and try our best to interpret Jesus in his first century context. So the goal of a lot of 19th century Jesus scholarship is amicable. I think that there are definitely a lot of libertarian Christians that would agree with this. And the goal is to liberate the Christ of dogma from the Jesus of history. So there was posited during this period this dichotomy between kind of the doctrinal Christ, the Christ that was taught in church, and then Jesus as he actually existed in history. In a lot of ways, this goes back to Reimarus, the first real scholar of the historical Jesus, who posited that there had to be this dichotomy, that the actual Jesus of history had to be dramatically different than the Christ of faith. And it was the goal and the responsibility of New Testament scholars to try to probe that difference. So where do these doctrines end, and where does the historical Jesus begin, so to speak? And so the dogmatic Christ is going to be according to Moxnes, and there's a lot of good evidence for this as well, it's the dogmatic Christ that in a lot of ways propped up the monarchies in the time periods leading up to the 19th century. Because again, in Europe, you had this idea of the divine right of kings, that kings ruled because God wanted them to rule, and they were able to use dogmatic presentations of Christ to justify their political leadership. And so the political consequence of historical Jesus research in a lot of ways was to delegitimize the idea of the divine right of king. And I do think that this is a positive development. As I've said on the show, there are many aspects of the dogmatic or doctrinal Christ that are also cultural constructions that are based on categories of thought from late antiquity and the Middle Ages, and then also projected back into history. And this is one massive problem that Protestants have, is that a lot of Protestants still operate within the theological categories of the 16th century. And so when they read the Gospels, they wind up producing a Jesus who thinks and acts and looks like a figure from the 16th century and not from the first century. And so Protestants are just as prone to falling into this historical trap as anybody else. And so I'm very critical of a lot of dogmatic or doctrinal presentations of Jesus, because I don't think that they attempt to do justice to him as a figure in history. And for me as a Christian, I believe that I worship the historical Jesus. And if you believe that the Bible is our only source of authority, or at least our primary source of authority, I would say, of course, that the Bible should be the only source of authority. I know not every Protestant agrees with me on that, and certainly my Catholic brothers and sisters don't. But if we do believe in the authority of Scripture, then there should be no difference between the Jesus of history and the Jesus of our doctrine. And I think that these scholars in the 19th century just made the assumption that there had to be a difference, and they wanted to understand that difference. So nationalism, again, is going to be, nationalism and its consequences, rather, are going to be very influential in 19th century reconstructions of the historical Jesus. And of course, we've talked, like I said before, we've already mentioned Albert Schweitzer. There are many other great criticisms of this historical process where biblical scholarship is more of a product of the culture of its time than giving an accurate or an objective or unbiased presentation of Jesus as he appeared in the past. Because again, the problem is, if you're going to undermine the dogmatic Christ, which is a worthwhile historical enterprise, what are you going to substitute it with? And it's always, we're going to substitute it with a presentation of the historical Jesus that's congenial to the sensibilities of the time period in which the historical reconstruction was written, in this case, the 19th century. We also have, I'm going to put a link into this old episode in the show notes, but I did an episode on Henry Cadbury's book, The Peril of Modernizing Jesus. And honestly, if there's one book that everyone should read on the historical Jesus, it is that book. It's the most important book on the historical Jesus I've ever read, and I think he does a better job of outlining the problems of our historical reconstructions of Jesus than anyone else. And essentially he says, and it's accurate, that we there are a lot of gaps in our knowledge about the historical Jesus because the writers of the Gospels don't feel like they needed to give us absolutely every detail of Jesus's life. And that's okay. We don't need that. I think we have everything that we need to understand who he was. But that being said, there are a lot of gaps in our knowledge. And when these gaps in our knowledge of Jesus arrive, we always tend to fill them with modern content. And this is true not only of 20th century New Testament scholarship and 19th century New Testament scholarship, but also of 16th century biblical scholarship and 4th century. So you see how this works, right? Is that we are so embedded in our own cultural context that it's almost impossible for us to understand that people of a different time period would have had radically different thought categories than us. And so when it comes to a figure like Jesus, where we have a lot more historical information about Jesus than we do many other figures in antiquity, so I'm not nihilistic about that. I think we have enough material to have a historically plausible reconstruction of Jesus, but there are a lot of gaps in our knowledge. And as Cadbury beautifully outlines in his book, we will always fill those gaps in our knowledge with modern content. And Moxnes is going to be in this tradition. So in this book, he is going to say that in a lot of ways, the gaps in our historical knowledge of Jesus are filled by nationalism. They're filled by this rise of these new nationalist movements. So that's a very important part of the process in this book, and one of the reasons why I wanted to discuss it, both because I think that as libertarians, and especially as libertarians like me that are interested in biblical studies and also interested in kind of those meta-historical intellectual questions of the ideas that underlie particular generations' interpretations of historical events, we have to reckon with the arguments that he makes in his book. There's that aspect of it too, and then Moxnes at the very end has a long and passionate chapter about wanting to get beyond nationalism, but I think that he makes a lot of mistakes and winds up importing more of a globalist, more of his globalist assumptions back into his reinterpretation of Jesus. And we're going to talk about all of those contradictions and all of those idiosyncrasies here in a couple of minutes. Now, before Moxnes can talk about the four biblical scholars that he's going to analyze in this book, he has to explain some of the main ideas that undergirded the rise of nationalism in the 19th century. And those three ideas are, of course, the word nationalism itself, which there have always been nations, and that etymologically there is a historical precedent for the word nation, but it came to mean something different in the 19th century than it did in the centuries that preceded it. So defining nationalism is the first problem. And then he also has two more issues that he has to address. One of them is the writing of biography, and the lives of Jesus that were written in the 19th century were written as a part of this literary genre, and that's tied into nationalism. And then also the new conception of homeland. So it's these three ideas, nationalism, biography, and homeland, that all kind of combine in the 19th century as these new nationalist projects were being built. So in the 19th century, we have the creation of this new category of nationalism, or this new way of understanding the category of nationalism. And it's critical to understand these three ideas, since all of the biblical scholars that Moxnes is going to analyze in his book are going to be operating within those conceptual categories. So the first one, of course, is nationalism itself. And he says that there are essentially three components of nationalism in the 19th century. And I think that these are the three components that we would understand nationalism to comprise today. And I've done a lot of work on Stephen Wolfe's The Case for Christian Nationalism, or whatever that book was called. And I think that Stephen Wolfe, one of the criticisms I made of his book is that his conception of nationalism is very much embedded in modern thought categories. So, these three components that Moxnes is going to outline of nationalism are equally applicable to Stephen Wolfe's book. So the three components are the idea of a people, the idea of a fixed territory with borders, and the idea of common values. So these three components, people, territory, and values, are all common to nationalism since the 19th century. When people think of a nation, they think of a people, a territory that is geographically defined with boundaries, and a set of values that characterizes those people. Now, he's going to make the point And he's absolutely right that there are no fixed and common meanings of either of these terms. And so there are a lot of people since the 19th century that have called themselves nationalist or that have been reacting to a form of nationalism that would say, yes, a nation is defined by a people, by a territory and values. But what do those three words mean? Especially something that is as deeply subjective and open to interpretation as values. What does it mean to have a national value, especially in a pluralistic society like America? So Moxnes makes the point that all of these terms are in flux, and there might be people that have certain nuances to their definition of nationalism that maybe differ from other people's, but these are the basic contours of that. So we have to understand that not only is nationalism this combination of people, territory, and values, but that those concepts can be variously interpreted and understood by different people that are proponents of or critics of nationalism. And he's going to call nationalism an idea that's under construction in the 19th century, but he is able to see in all of these works of the historical Jesus by these biblical scholars traces of those elements of nationalism. So when they think about Jesus being a part of, quote unquote, the Jewish nation in the first century, they are going to think of the Jewish nation in these 19th century categories instead of trying to understand what that could have meant for Jesus in the first century. Now, the other major issue that he has to deal with is the issue of biography. And biography is a completely new way of writing about Jesus that challenged the dogmatic conceptions of Christ, because up to that point, almost all of the writings about the Gospels had been systematic theology. It's doctrine, it's dogma. And so writing a life of Jesus in the form of a biography is a way of saying we are not doing the dogmatic thing that the theologians are doing. We are trying to reconstruct Jesus as a historical figure. So there's that supposed convergence, which I think that scholars like Ben Meyer and N.T. Wright, even though, again, his work on Paul has several flaws that I've talked about already on the show, but he's very good on a lot of these Jesus issues. They've demonstrated that there's not really a separation there shouldn't be a separation. There didn't have to be a separation between the Christ of dogma and the Jesus of history, but they operate within that conceptual category. And in the 19th century, writing a biography meant that you were trying to undermine dogmatic conceptions of Christ. Biography is also going to be a developed genre during the 19th century that is going to favor nationalism. So there are going to be all kinds of biographies that are written about people that are supposed to embody the nationalist ethos of countries like England and France and Germany. And so biography as a genre is sort of a great man of history way of writing, and it's going to favor this new kind of nationalism. And the subjects in these biographies are often going to portray moral and political values that the author favors. And in a lot of ways, it's often written with the goal of giving elites more power in society. And so you have a 19th century biography writer, they write a history of some or a biography of some contemporary figure. That person is supposed to represent the values of that nation and also be an example to other elites who want to have more power in society. And these Jesus biographies are a part of this model of writing. And so they're deeply, even writing about Jesus in the form of a biography is a deeply contextual, historically contextual way of understanding who he is as a figure. So we have our concept of nationalism. We have the fact that biography writing is tied up with nationalism and often is designed to portray national values. And then you have the concept of the homeland. Now, I do want to read a very short excerpt on this from his book because it's really important the way that he defines homeland. I think that it gives us a lot to think about here. And he is going to say this about homeland. He says the Orientalism, which is an exploration of the East as opposed to an exploration of Europe, was ultimately a political vision of reality whose structure promoted the difference between the familiar, European, the West, us, and the strange, the Orient, the East, and other. This is a perspective that has been very influential and fruitful not only in studies of the Orient, but in post-colonial studies of all parts of the world. Nevertheless, it is also a perspective that has been rightly criticized as too monolithic. My experience of the schoolhouse map suggests that a simplistic understanding of Orientalism is too one-sided to explain the multifaceted relationship between European societies and Palestine in the 19th century. For Christian Europeans, Palestine was above all the Holy Land, so that there was a special relationship between Holy Land and homeland with a reciprocal exchange. The Holy Land was appropriated into the familiar, into homeland, but in a similar way, the homeland nation shaped the understanding of the Holy Land. Placing Holy Land together with homeland suggests a complex relationship between Orientalism and nationalism. And so again, the main point that he is making here is that the way in which people are going to conceive of the homeland of Jesus, of Palestine at the time, of Judea. They're going to conceptualize that in the nationalist terms of 19th century European states. And there's going to be this natural kind of both connection and tension between these two ideas that in a lot of ways, Jesus's cultural context represents the East. It's Oriental. It's different from the West. But in a lot of ways, it's going to be wrapped up into the familiar Western way of understanding nationhood and of understanding homeland that is so important for the development of 19th century nationalism. Now, he's going to dive into four of the most influential scholars of the 19th century, and two of these you're going to be very familiar with already. We're going to be talking about D.F. Strauss and Ernst Renan in the episode I did on the socialist roots of modern biblical studies, where I compared these two to F.A. Hayek's book, The Counter-Revolution of Science, because both of them made an appearance in The Counter-Revolution of Science. I kind of talked about both of them, so I'm not going to give you an introduction for those, but we also have Fredrich Schleiermacher, who I think I've talked about on the show a couple of times, and then George Adam Smith, who's an English scholar that I believe is a new figure for you, my audience. Now, what I'm going to do here is instead of trying to explain my way through these very dense chapters, because Moxnes is a very technical writer and he gives a lot of details, what I'm going to do instead is just read a little excerpt from the intro to each article and then a little excerpt from the outro to each article, so you can kind of you get a sense of who this historical Jesus scholar was, and then you get a sense of the way that their reconstruction of Jesus dovetailed with the rise of nationalism in the 19th century. Now, all four of these are very influential, and all four of these have been foundational for the discipline of New Testament study. So it's really important that we dive into all of these. Now, Schleiermacher is a very, very important figure, and I have a very short biography. I'm going to put a link to this. I found it on the Christian Classics Ethereal Library, because Moxnes doesn't really have, I think Schleiermacher is so influential that Moxnes doesn't feel that he needs to have a strong introduction for him. So I wanted to give you just a little bit of his background here, just so you kind of know who he is. So Fredrich Schleiermacher was born on November 21st, 1768 in Breslau, Lower Silesia, now Warsaw, Poland, Warsaw, I don't know. Sorry. If I have anyone listening from Poland, I'm sorry that I'm not pronouncing the name of your city right. It's spelled Wroclaw. It's in Poland. So despite his being the son of a Reformed clergyman, Schleiermacher studied under the Moravian Brethren, gaining from them an appreciation for the Latin and Greek classics and a strong sense of religious life. He found the teachings of the Herrenhutters too restrictive, however, because the faculty refused to lecture on current intellectual trends. In 1787, he entered the University of Halle, where he studied the philosophies of Aristotle and Immanuel Kant. After his ordination in 1794, he accepted a position as a Reformed preacher in Berlin. There he mingled with German Romantic philosophers, became a friend of Friedrich von Schlegel, and began a translation of the works of Plato. Apart from a period when he was professor of theology at Halle, most of his life from his ordination in 1796 until his death was spent as a preacher and teacher in Berlin. From 1810, he was a professor of theology at the newly founded university there. Schleiermacher's first major work on religion, which is published, I think, in 1799, defended religion against its Enlightenment critics. Religion, he argued, was not a philosophy, nor abstract metaphysical thought, nor natural science, nor adherence to dogmatic formulae, but the sense and taste for the infinite, consisting primarily in feeling. Belief and action are secondary. Again, you can see that divide between religion and then dogmatics there. Knowledge of the soul and knowledge of God are inseparable, a concept that had presented more than 1,000 years earlier by St. Augustine. He thought thus has a subjective focus, but it should not on that account be deemed sheer subjectivism. All right. Schleiermacher's careful analysis of religious feelings always had its in view, at least by implication, the infinite and eternal reality to which these feelings responded. Okay, so there's a little background of Schleiermacher as we dive into his work in the book. So again, he's a massively influential New Testament scholar during this time period, and we're going to read just a little bit about his background and then the way that his reconstruction of Jesus was shaped by nationalist ideologies during this time period. So here's what Moxnes has to say about him. He says this. Much seemed to be in flux at the time Schleiermacher gave his first lectures on the historical Jesus at the University of Berlin in 1819. He framed them explicitly as a biography with the purpose of writing the life of Jesus as the life of a human person. The goal for Schleiermacher was to place Jesus in interaction with his time, age, and people, that is, as an individual in relationship to his people in a specific period. This was no purely historical undertaking. Schleiermacher emphasized that the lectures must also be relevant for his own time. If, therefore, we cannot extract Christ from his historical setting in order to think of him within that of our people in our age, it follows again that the knowledge of him has no practical value, for he ceases to have exemplary character. Very interesting admission by Schleiermacher there. Moxnes goes on. A biography of Jesus was therefore both of historical and of hermeneutical importance. For Schleiermacher, history was not disinterested, but always undertaken in dialogue with the present situation. It is this interaction between the image of Jesus and the contemporary context that is the main interest in my discussion of Schleiermacher's lectures. This contemporary context is understood in a comprehensive way. It includes Schleiermacher's development as a religious thinker, the social and political situation in Prussia at the time, and also his own situation as a university professor under suspicion from the state bureaucracy. With his collection of speeches on religion from 1799, Schleiermacher established the modern religious subject who found religion in the experience of utter dependency and not in supernatural revelation. This book and Schleiermacher's follow-up on its perspectives, especially in his Christian faith, represented one of the most important transformations in the history of theology. He shifted the ground from the institutional authority of the church, which is dogmas, to the human subject and his or her experience of the divine. It was a religious equivalent of the political transformation represented by the American and French revolutions, taking symbolic power from the monarch and reinvesting it in citizenship and the nation. Both of these transformations represented a greater focus on the individual subject, at first located primarily among the intellectuals and elites, but eventually spreading widely across different social classes. The quest for the self and for authenticity was not only a philosophical and intellectual undertaking inspired by pietism and revival movements, it was also part of being a true Christian. Similarly, the political transformation of power towards citizenship and nations provided new context and new horizons for the individual and his or her identity. How could such new individual self-consciousness be formed, and how could this new individual be integrated into and even take responsibility for new collectives like the nation? What was the relationship between the individual and the nation in a period when neither of them was clearly established or settled? These were matters of great concern for Schleiermacher, as reflected in many of his writings and activities, and he always emphasized that the individual was part of a community, be it a household, the church, or the state. In this chapter, I suggest that these are some of the underlying issues for Schleiermacher's lectures on the life of Jesus, and that they are influenced by the particular situation in which they were given. Schleiermacher was actively engaged in the national cause against Napoleon's warfare in the German states, and had strong views on the questions of citizenship and state authority. In the period of restoration after Napoleon's defeat in 1815, these ideas were not popular with the state authorities. Schleiermacher did not, like Strauss and Renan, face censure and loss of position because of his lectures on Jesus. However, in 1817 and for several years afterwards, Schleiermacher was under investigation by the Prussian state bureaucracy for views expressed in his lectures on the state, for his support of the student movements of radical nationalism, and for his sermons for suspicion that they contained hidden political exhortations. In his lectures on the historical Jesus, it is possible to find implicit references to all of these issues. Schleiermacher's lectures on Jesus, explicitly placing him in relation to his time, age, and people, must therefore necessarily participate also in the political discourse of their time. Reading Schleiermacher's Life of Jesus as a biography, which is Schleiermacher's biography, his work on Jesus, means to read it from a different perspective than from within the history of New Testament research, which has a primary interest in the evaluation of sources, the question of their historicity, and the development of analytical methods. Reading Schleiermacher's Life of Jesus as a biography is also different from undertaking a theological interpretation of the lectures in light of Schleiermacher's Christology as he developed it in the Christian faith. My focus will be on the lectures as a biography in the context of Schleiermacher's engagement in the struggle for a German nation. In Chapter 1, the contribution of Schleiermacher in raising the question of what it means to write about Jesus in the form of a biography was discussed. The main questions concern biography as a form of writing history, their relationship between the individual and the common life, and Jesus as a special or unique person. In this chapter, we will explore how Schleiermacher develops these general issues in specific areas of the life of Jesus. The question of sources is important in writing history, so Schleiermacher discusses and defends his choice of John's Gospel as his primary source, which is another interesting one. Since the presentation of an individual subject always takes place in a social context, the question of the location of Jesus' activities was important in all 19th century biographies. Schleiermacher gave his lectures before the full impact of the travel narratives to Palestine had occurred, but he does have his own version of the relationship between Holy Land and homeland. These questions concerning the content of Schleiermacher's picture of Jesus are illuminated through the biographical form he uses. Schleiermacher uses the different types of biography that were popular in the 19th century, namely those of the great man, of the learned man, and the religious ideal, to present a Jesus who is of practical value and has exemplary character for the religious and political situation of Schleiermacher's own time. So we can see here that Moxnes is situating the work of Schleiermacher within the rise and development of the nationalist movements at that time. And he's going to give a great summary of Schleiermacher's work at the very end of his chapter here. And this is what he's going to say as he rounds up his chapter. He says, Schleiermacher's starting point for his life of Jesus was to present the topic in terms of a human biography based on the central idea that no person can be cut loose from his time, age, and people. Did he succeed in describing Jesus as a human person in the context of his people and nation, the focus of our study in this chapter? Schleiermacher's human Jesus shows strong similarities to the Christ of his dogmatic writings, hence the criticism that Schleiermacher drew from Strauss and Schweitzer. But in his life of Jesus, Schleiermacher describes Jesus in fully human categories and within a historical narrative. However, the substructure of his biography is the concept of the great man as the one who determines history and moves it forward, a very popular model in 19th century history and dogmatics, as well as in eulogies of kings. But whereas this often would result in an image of the solitary hero versus the masses, in Schleiermacher's anthropology, the individual is always part of a community and thus stands in a mutual relationship of interdependence with it. Schleiermacher describes this community with a cluster of terms that belong to early 19th century discourse about people, nation, and national identity or characteristics. It was a discourse that did not yet have a German state as its concrete point of reference. There were only various ideas about a German nation and what would characterize this nation, among them a sense of belonging together and language. For Schleiermacher, language was of significant importance in Jesus' tradition to his people, since Jesus must express his knowledge of God, the basis for his existence, in the common language. However, it is what Jesus had to say about God that represents his directing influence upon the people. And it is in Schleiermacher's description of Jesus' directing influence that he presents his vision of how Jesus defines the people and influences the idea of the nation. This influence was expressed above all through Jesus' mission, his communication of himself to the people. Here, Schleiermacher moves his readers beyond divisions according to small political entities and tribal regions to a notion of the totality of the land and the totality of the people. In analogy with Schleiermacher's view of the divisions of Germany in his time, this was not a state that yet existed. His imagination is of a nation that Jesus brings into being with his mission, so to speak. The ideal nation, moreover, is not imagined as a state. Schleiermacher's presentation of Jesus' preaching of the kingdom of God places it in a strong contrast to Jewish theocracy. In that theocracy, God was represented as a sort of overlord of a state, that is, in the terms of the autocratic rule of kings and princes of Schleiermacher's own day. By contrast, Jesus' kingdom represents a transition to another type of structure, that of the household, which is described as non-political. Indeed, it is more adequate to speak of it as pre-political. Schleiermacher points thereby to what for him is the fundamental basis for human community, the family and household. This type of community belongs to the given structures of life. This has two important consequences. First, the people in the nation that Schleiermacher imagines as a cultural entity. It is the idea of a community based on a common language and a sense of commonality. It is not a political project or a state. Second, the individual and the community to which he or she belongs, be it a household or a church, has dignity and independence vis-a-vis a state. Schleiermacher's concern in presenting the biography of Jesus was historical but also hermeneutical, so that the knowledge of Jesus might have practical value in a contemporary setting. With his portrait of Jesus set explicitly in the context of the totality of the Jewish nation, Schleiermacher has fused the landscape of the Jewish land and people with his imagination of a German land and a nation in his own time. Schleiermacher's theology, centered on the experience of the individual and the historical Jesus, here received the narrative from whereby the interrelationship between individual and collectivity was told as the relationship between Jesus and the nation. So again, a little bit of a long reading there, but you can see how all of these 19th century influences are making their way into Schleiermacher's work. That Schleiermacher is deliberately, well, maybe not deliberately. I think he is conceptualizing Jesus in ways that are congenial to his own 19th century German experience. And this is a really great foundation for the way that we are going to understand these other four writers that Moxnes is going to discuss in his book. So the next one that he is going to talk about is D.F. Strauss, and I'm not going to give you an introduction for D.F. Strauss. You can go back, and I highly encourage you, if you haven't, go back and listen to my episode on the socialist roots of modern biblical studies. I talk a little bit about the life of Strauss. I'm just going to jump right into what Moxnes says about Strauss. Again, very influential. His life of Jesus was incredibly controversial. Albert Schweitzer dedicates 3 chapters in the quest to the historical Jesus just to this one scholar. So I want to, you should already know who he is. And if you don't, go back and listen to that. I'm just going to jump right into what Moxnes has to say about the relationship between Strauss and nationalism. So he says this: when the young theologian David Fredrich Strauss published his Life of Jesus critically examined in 1835, it caused an immediate uproar. This was not just because it was a radical theological book, its main thesis being that the gospel stories were not history but myths that originated among the early Christian communities. Indeed, it was this thesis that made the book so significant within the theological profession and turned it into a reference point for modern New Testament studies. But at the time, its influence was much wider. It changed the intellectual landscape of Europe with its criticism of religious foundations, and it had strong political repercussions. How could this almost 800-page, very detailed, academically argued book have such an effect, not just in theological and church circles, but also in society at large? Two comments by contemporary authors may help us to grasp the mentality of Europe in the first part of the 19th century. A comment by the poet and critic Heinrich Heine, 1 year before Strauss's book was published, illuminates the context within which it appeared. He described the situation as one in which Christianity and the old regime formed an absolutely inseparable alliance. It was this alliance to which Strauss's Life of Jesus dealt a deadly blow. Another comment by the renowned theologian F.C. Bauer describes how the book created reactions in both areas. The Life of Jesus evoked panic-stricken terror in the breasts of the defenders of the political status quo and images of the proximity of Satan into souls of the defenders of Christian orthodoxy. The book apparently struck at the intersection between religion and politics. Its criticism of the historical Jesus affected both Christology and the monarchy. The reaction to Strauss's Life of Jesus illustrates the proposition that religious symbols play an important role in the process of the transformation of politics from monarchy to citizenship and nation. However, this may not have been Strauss's intention. His critical views on the church's tradition about Jesus did not translate into radical politics on his part. He began as a liberal and became increasingly conservative. Thus, in contrast to Schleiermacher, whose words and life appeared to be closely interconnected, Strauss's text may have had a life of its own, independent of its author. The picture becomes more complicated when we try to follow the development of Strauss's presentation of Jesus. Their character changes over time from a democratic image of Jesus to one that seems to support the power of the state, linking nation and empire. Thus, Strauss is an example of the fact that the historical movement, in this case from authoritarian monarchy to nation, does not always proceed in one direction. Strauss's various images of Jesus show how the democratic impulses and nationalism can be co-opted by an authoritarian state. Therefore, rather than seeking Strauss's intention behind each text, we will ask what readings the text themselves opened up in the context of their time. I'm not a big fan of the reader response approach, but still, he does a great job of outlining how Strauss's approach to the Bible is going to intersect with nationalism in his own life. And then he is going to make the conclusion at the end of this, and I'm going to read just a part of this for you guys here, where he talks about Strauss's German Jesus, and Moxnes has this to say: the discussion in this chapter is focused on the Germanness of Strauss's presentation of Jesus, because again, Jesus is presented in specifically nationalist categories, and his nationalist categories are going to be inherently German. So you have this idea of like a 19th century German Jesus making their way through the pages of Strauss's work. The discussion in this chapter is focused on the Germanness of Strauss's presentation of Jesus. Less focused in this discussion has been the masculine character of this Germanness, but it is always present in Strauss's text, combined with an emphasis on the power of empires, the progress of force, and military vocabularies. In all of these different versions, Jesus represented a masculine ideal with whom a modern man could identify. Jesus was a spiritual, apolitical, religious, moral, in a world full of power, war, and oppression. This was the cultural ideal of Strauss, an image of the civilized citizen in a world that otherwise must be ruled by strong power. This latter power embodied hegemonic masculinity, i.e. the dominant forms of masculinity that emerged in periods of contestations and conflict. In Prussia, after the 1870s, in the German Empire, hegemonic masculinity was represented by the soldier, or rather by the officer embodying military power. In this context, Strauss presented Jesus as an ideal of civilized masculinity at home, in a peaceful room filled with books and music, but outside that room, another more aggressive and powerful masculinity had the hegemony. The distance between Jesus of the pre-modern past and Strauss's ideals of a modern masculinity was bridged by attributing to Jesus masculine characteristics well at home in the 19th century Germany. But finally, Strauss's bridge broke down. In the Old Faith and the New, the distance between the civilized world of the 19th century and Jesus' world in the first century became unbridgeable. And this is another one of D.F. Strauss's work. He's going to sum it up by saying this paradigm of masculine contrast with a part of larger cultural systems of binary oppositions and hierarchies at work in different ways through Strauss's writing. Now, one of the problems I do have with Moxnes' book, and this is going to be something that I'll discuss in a couple of minutes when we get to the final chapter where he tries to present an alternative to a nationalistic reading of Jesus, is that it's very clear that Moxnes is operating within the categories of critical theory, and a lot of that is going to color his interpretation of these 19th century scholars. One of the ironies of this book, and one of the ironies of all historical Jesus research, especially research like the research that Moxnes is conducting in this book, is that he is rightly criticizing these 19th century scholars for importing all of their 19th century ideas back into Jesus and for making their cultural context the hermeneutical framework through which they read the Gospels. But then Moxnes is guilty of doing the exact same thing with 21st century critical categories as well. So he's rejecting 19th century interpretations of Jesus, but instead he is refracting his understanding of Jesus through 21st century hermeneutical and interpretive and cultural categories such as critical theory. It's a tension that's really going to be obvious in the last part of his book. And while I think Moxnes does an excellent job of breaking down the relationship between nationalism and the rise of biblical studies, I don't think he's able to transcend his own cultural biases in the end. Not that any of us can, but that's to get ahead of myself. The next one that we're going to take a look at very briefly here, the last couple ones we'll go quick. I don't have a lot on these because we're already kind of seeing how these scholars are operating within these systems. The next one, of course, is Ernst Renan, who we talked about in a previous episode. And so we're just going to go over his life of Jesus and how that dovetails with his understanding of nationalism. Here's what Moxnes says about Ernst Renan, who is French, by the way. So the first two scholars, Schleiermacher and Strauss, were from Germany, and he talks about how Schleiermacher and Strauss both fit within German conceptions of nationalism. He's going to show in this chapter how Renan fits into French categories of nationalism. And then his chapter on George Adam Smith, he was an Englishman, so he's going to show how he fits in with English conceptions of nationalism at the time. So all of these are deeply embedded, again, in the cultural context of their developing nations. Here's what he says about Renan. Jesus was an incomparable man who some call God. This statement by Ernst Renan was part of his opening lecture as a professor in Hebrew at the Collège de France on 21st February 1862. 4 days later, his course was suspended by the Emperor Napoleon III, and in 1864, Renan was dismissed from his chair. Views of Jesus that threatened his divinity and described him as a human person were controversial, not only in the churches and among theologians, but also within the structures of an empire and among conservative politicians. And this controversy increased when Renan's Life of Jesus was published in 1863. The book became an immediate success and a public sensation. It was printed in many editions in its first year and immediately translated into several European languages. It became the first really popular biography of Jesus written in a literary style of high popularization of an academic work. In one sense, the book is a period piece of the 19th century. This was an age of deconstruction of traditional social, cultural, and political forms, as well as one of reconstruction of finding new means to explain, understand, and structure the world. It was a period characterized by a search for the origins of the present world order, in which the various scholarly disciplines were searching for the roots of the particular area that they were studying as their way to contribute to that larger search. The most prominent place, of course, was taken by Darwin's Origin of the Species. It reflected the central position of biology and the natural sciences in the efforts to understand the world, and such scientific ideals also influenced the social studies and humanities. I wrote in the margins of this paper, Saint-Simon here, if you go back and listen to my episode on the counter-revolution of science, this is exactly what Hayek was talking about in this book, that at the beginning of the 19th century, the language and methods of science were illegitimately applied to the social studies, and that led to the rise of authoritarianism and totalitarianism. And so even though Moxnes here doesn't mention Saint-Simon, it's very clear that those Saint-Simonian Comtean ideas are lurking in the background of his criticism of nationalist reconstructions of Jesus. So it's really important to remember that. If you haven't listened to that episode, please go back and do so. The counter-revolution of science is the key to understanding this whole period, and then I think a lot of the political dysfunction that we're facing in the world today. That aside, Moxnes continues with Renan. Within the humanities, philology emerged as a modern form of science. Ideas of nations and nationalisms had one of their roots in the search for ancient languages, as Herder's Origin of Language made clear. Among these investigations, Renan took his place most famously with his studies of the origin of languages, playing a central role in the establishing of two main groups of languages, the Indo-European or Aryan and the Semitic. Additionally, he wrote a multi-volume work on the origins of Christianity that shared the same purpose of other studies of origins, namely to lay a scientific foundation for the history of the present phenomenon. It is as the first volume in this history of the origins of Christianity that Renan's Life of Jesus appeared in 1863. This context sets the tone for the book. for the book, it places Jesus at the center of a specific investigation into the origins of Christianity. In Renan's view of modern religion, the human Jesus was the providential beginning of the history that through progress would lead to its goal, a common humanity. Again, the method and language of the science applied to history, this is exactly what Hayek was talking about. And Saint-Simon is the person who, more than anyone else, is responsible for these ideas fanning out into Europe. So he gives a presentation of Renan's biography of Jesus, and then he's going to conclude his chapter by making these statements. And again, he's going to racialize. He's going to kind of see racial categories within Renan. Here's what he says. He says the above discussion of a broader context for Renan's use of the term race, because again, race is a concept. The modern idea of race is a concept that's also derived from the 19th century, and Renan makes use of that in his text, or at least implicitly does, according to Moxnes. He says, the above discussion of a broader context for Renan's use of the term race is not meant to take away from the negative picture of the Semitic race in Renan, where the 19th century Muslims blend with the first century Jew into a common other. Significantly, in Renan's life of Jesus, it is the contrast between Galilee and Jerusalem with their acceptance or rejection of Jesus that provides the historic material for this paradigm of us and the other, which is critical to all nationalist ideologies. That Strauss read the gospel material in a similar way is no coincidence. Both Strauss and Renan found their main source in the Logia material, a collection of sayings accredited to Jesus, now called Q. This is the two-source hypothesis of the synoptic problem, and in the narratives of Jesus' life in Mark and Matthew, which made possible a reading of conflict between Galilee and Jerusalem. It was the interest in a national identity with biological race as a central category that created a paradigm of race and national characteristics for interpretation of these texts. This example shows that source criticism is not an innocent or neutral form of scholarship. Rather, it can easily be used for ideological purposes. That's absolutely true. He goes on to say, Sean Kelly has explored this paradigm of interpretation and the influence of radical thinking in the 19th and parts of the earliest 20th century, and just goes on to show how influential it is on the rest of subsequent New Testament scholarship. It is possible to see the recurrence of Renan's characterization of Galilee and Jerusalem in stereotypical pictures of the development of early Christianity in these scholars. And some of the scholars that he mentions are scholars like Bultmann, Robert Frank, and John Dominic Crossan, and also the very influential Tübingen school. All of them are going to be using ideas that were derived from Renan. Very important to keep that in mind. As I said, one of my overarching theses over the last several episodes, or the episodes where we've dealt specifically with this issue, is that the foundation of modern biblical studies, just like the foundation of all modern political conceptions, can be traced back to the 19th century, and we have to understand how those categories might have implicitly influenced our reading of the historical material, and Moxnes is going to say correctly that they do. So again, as he says, it is possible to see the recurrence of Renan's characterization of Galilee and Jerusalem in stereotypical pictures of the development of early Christianity in these scholars. The character of Jesus shows values associated with the West, like individualism, authenticity, and creative powers. The decline was represented by inauthenticity, decay, and institutionalization associated with the Orient. This was not just a paradigm of historical representation. It used hermeneutically to express the distinction between us and the others. This is a paradigm that is closely linked to racism, and again, I think he's using racism in the 19th century way of the concept here. Its use to structure thoughts and representations does not necessarily express an author's intentions, but shows the pervasiveness of racial thinking. So it's very, very important here that we keep that in mind. He's also going to finish this out by saying the heritage from the 19th century lives on. Renan's claim that the race of Jesus should not be discussed was followed up by the so-called second quest of the historical Jesus. The very term race was discredited after the Second World War and the Holocaust, and it disappeared from Jesus studies because of the use of racial categories to make him into an Aryan in Nazi scholarship. So in the second quest, Jesus was moved into a religious sphere where race also disappeared, together with all the issues that race implies. But race is not an abstract category. Those who experience the power of race today are predominantly also those who live in poverty, who suffer illness, who experience discrimination and lack of power. There's critical theory stuff. Not to speak of Jesus and race means to lift him up above these structures of inequality, oppression, and divisions into our own picture of ourselves. It is this danger of speaking idealistically of a common humanity, of overcoming racism, without seeing how we are a part of the problem, not least in our lingering and unfocused usage of the term race, that is the really unsettling heritage of Renan. All right, so there's some stuff there that I wouldn't agree with, but for the most part, his picture is correct. Renan is a man of his time. time, just like all the other scholars that we've been looking at today, and we have to understand him as such. The fourth and final scholar that Moxnes is going to outline in this book is an English scholar named Sir George Adam Smith, who lived from 1856 to 1942. And I'm sorry, he's not English, he's Scottish. So I want to make sure that we're very clear about that. But you know how that goes. For Americans, everyone that lives on the British Isles is English, right? But he's actually Scottish. And here's a short biography that I'll put a link to this short biography in the show notes here. He's a Scottish scholar of the Bible and the geography of Palestine. Goes back to that homeland thing, the research that was being done on Palestine during that time. Smith was ordained as a minister in the United Free Church of Scotland, became professor of Hebrew and Old Testament studies at Church College, Glasgow, and was principal of Aberdeen University. His main work was the historical geography of the Holy Land, which was published in 1894, which proved immensely popular as the best written and most scholarly account of the subject. He had a profound understanding of the permanent geographical factors and their influence on history. Now, here's what Moxnes is going to say about George Adam Smith and his influence in this in his book. Here he says the introduction is titled "The Introduction to Adam Smith." Here, George Adam Smith, not the economist, but this biblical scholar, says, "Introduction: Britain as a Nation." If the subtext for presentations of Jesus in Galilee for Schleiermacher and Strauss was the building of the German nation-state, and for Renan it was the ambiguous relation to the Oriental other, what was it for British pictures of Jesus? The answer to that question must be sought in the history of England. Different from Germany, where we might say that the idea of a nation came before the creation of a German state, England was a state-nation where the state was established before nationalism, and the legitimacy of the state was based on the monarch. There was a political stability of borders and territories, but it is debatable whether Great Britain should be spoken of as a nation-state. Since the beginning of the 18th century, it was a United Kingdom, but one might say that it consisted of several nations, at least the English, the Scots, the Welsh, and the Irish. Again, going back to my mistakenly labeling him as English, even though he's technically Scottish. I'm going to leave that for somebody from a different culture to draw out here. Moreover, it was also a colonial power, and from the 19th century an empire, which provided a larger context for national identities. Nevertheless, Linda Colley has argued that there developed a common identity as Britons in the latter part of the 18th and the beginning of the 19th century, an identity which to a large extent was based on Protestantism. This Protestant identity played an important role both in defining Britain vis-a-vis external Catholic powers like France and Spain, but also internally against the Stuart dynasty. So Coley concludes that Protestantism was the foundation that made the invention of Great Britain possible. An identity as British in contrast to the other was reinforced in the beginning of the 19th century through the conflict with Napoleonic France. Later, with industrialization and urbanization, other issues became pressing, notably those related to social change, changes in family and gender roles, and the rise of a poor working class. At the same time, the responsibilities and possibilities of the empire became a determining context for the education and training of large numbers of young men in the upper and middle classes. The central role of men both in development at home and within the growing British Empire makes it relevant to focus on the relationship between masculinity and nationalism. In periods when identities were under pressure, they were often reshaped through contestations and discussions of hegemonic masculinities, which John Tosh describes as the masculine norms and practices which are most valued by the politically dominant class and which help to maintain its authority. A central component of such hegemonic masculinity was respectability, a norm that was closely related to nationalism, not only with regard to sexual morality, but in all areas of social and individual life. Respectability, says George Mose in his study of middle-class morality in Germany and England, was thought essential for the maintenance of an ordered society. The bourgeois had created the age of commerce and industry, and it feared what it had created. Thus, respectability became the code word for the morality of the British middle classes. It was an ideal that they also tried to impose on the working class, and which before long was accepted by large sectors of the working classes. This respectability was a societal responsibility, but it was also expressed in an individualized form as a question of personal character. Since men had the dominant role in society, we may say justifiably that the issue of how to build a male character was central to the question of British authority. Was central to the question of British national identity in the last part of the 19th century. With their strong emphasis on ethics, evangelical Protestants who played important roles in British society in the 19th century strongly supported the building of a national character, which to them was the same as a Christian character. Now, at the very end of this chapter, he's going to give a summary here of all of the arguments that precede it, and then I'm going to read just a very brief summary of all of these scholars here. So I want to make sure that you guys have all of this information so that you know exactly what you need to know to understand these scholars. So he's going to say here as I said, is a summary of both George Adam Smith and then the 4 other scholars that he is going to address before he gets into his final chapter, which I'm going to critique and then get you guys out of here, hopefully on time. So here's his conclusion. It says, George Adam Smith's picture of Jesus in Galilee stands at the end of the 19th century, the last in a line of presentation, starting with Schleiermacher in the first part of the century and continuing with Strauss and Renan in the middle of the century. The purpose of this chapter, together with the preceding ones, has been to investigate how the rise of nationalism and the first quest for the historical Jesus were combined and interacted with one another, so that the result was an image of Jesus as a figure of identification for modern readers, not only as a model for personal identity, but also as one for shaping the nation and Europe. For this reason, Jesus was configured differently in different nations and at different times. This is like going back to what I was saying earlier. This is the Cadbury paradox, that we all try to read our own historical context into the historical Jesus. So Moxnes goes on to explain how this works. Our study has shown that there were 3 main ideas on areas of study that were combined and worked together to produce paradigmatic pictures of Jesus. One, the first idea is that of the great man as the main shaper of history and the founder of nations. Jesus embodied the great man from antiquity. He provided a putatively direct contact with the classical roots of modern European nations and the origins of their culture, whilst at the same time he represented progress and development. Although critical of the church's Christology, the quest for the historical Jesus was not introduced as a secular idea. Rather, it represented history under the providence of God. The idea of the great man in history as developing from antiquity under the providence of God represents what Charles Taylor calls a social imaginary, or a commonly accepted view of how the world works. The second idea was the ideology of nationhood nationalism, which was the cultural and political view of how the world ought to work in a specific context, differing from country to country and over time. Nationalism was the social and political setting of the lives of Jesus that we have studied. Jesus' historical relationship to the people and territories of Galilee and Palestine provided parallels to issues of nation and national identity in the 19th century. Finally, historical Jesus scholarship was related closely to source criticism of the Gospels, another area of New Testament studies that developed in the 19th century. Source criticism started out as a question about whether John's Gospel or the 3 synoptic Gospels were the most reliable source. Subsequently, the question was refined with discussions of the sources behind the Gospels themselves and of the synoptic problem, which is the literary relationship between the 3 synoptic Gospels. The question have played a central role in traditional histories of the historical Jesus scholarship. It has mostly been overlooked, however, that the study of literary criticism and the history of tradition were not disinterested scholarly investigations, but rather part of ideological trends and reflected political interest in the 19th century. These 3 ideologies and cultural areas were variously combined in presentations of the historical Jesus and thus produced different images of him and of a nation. For Schleiermacher, lecturing at a time when the unified German state did not yet exist, Jesus was portrayed as directing his mission to the whole people and the whole land and thus, so to speak, imagining a nation. The image of King Fredrich II as the ideal great man who embodied the people was a model for Schleiermacher's Jesus and contributed to his ideal of a democratic nation. Schleiermacher's choice of John's Gospel as his main source reflected his idea of the unity of the German people. In John, Jesus' mission is directed at the whole country, and Jesus could not be located primarily in Galilee. Schleiermacher wrote in a period before the Synoptic Gospels or their sources were accepted as the best historical basis for a life of Jesus. This later stage is reflected in the books by Strauss and Renan. In these gospel sources, Galilee was Jesus' main location, and Jerusalem and Judea were places of conflict in Jesus' death. Therefore, Galilee became an ideal, either because the population there responded positively to Jesus with Strauss, or because the landscape itself inspired Jesus with Renan. In this way, Galilee represented the beginning of Christianity. It was identified with the new humanity, while Jerusalem represented the old faith. This was an old figure of contrast that was now played out and justified with the modern sciences of geography, philology, and literary criticism, and eventually the biology of race. For both Strauss and Renan, the contrast between Galilee and Jerusalem became a paradigm for modern contrast related to national unity and characteristics. For Strauss, it took the form of the divide between the Protestant North and Catholic South in Germany, and the period of Bismarck's power politics leading up to a unified Germany. Jesus became a non-political messiah in the shadow of the Roman Empire. For Renan, Galilee and Jerusalem prefigured the contrast between the French nation, representing humanity, versus the Muslim Orient or even Germany as a nation based on race. Renan's Jesus was shaped by Galilee, but at the same time he was a great man who initiated a new humanity without racial divisions. However, Renan's ideal carried with it racial prejudices as part of its heritage. For Smith, Jesus was without discussion placed in Galilee within a vivid description of landscape and geography. Smith shared with Renan the experience of traveling to Galilee, so that the landscape itself became a source for his picture of Jesus too. The books of both men were examples of an interest in the Holy Land that was so much a part of modern European religion, scholarly activity, growing growing tourism and politics in the second part of the 19th century. More than Renan, Smith shared a tradition of explicit English identification between Holy Land and homeland, but like Renan, he also represented an imperial gaze when looking at the Holy Land. Smith, like Strauss and Renan, saw Galilee as a model for modern society, but the contrast to Jerusalem did not play an important role. Rather, the conflicts are described as internal to Galilee. The Greek and Roman world of commerce, power, and sensuality was present within the land, as similar forces were also present in Smith's Britain. These forces represent temptations. Thus, Smith's Galilee is portrayed in terms of moral geography. Against this background, Smith's picture of Jesus takes its form. The common great man ideal is expressed in the image of Jesus portrayed as a young man who overcomes the temptation of sex and success. He becomes thereby an example of the character that is necessary to build both a person and a nation, and with them an empire. The 19th century constructions of Jesus in Palestine are a form of the historical imagination of Jesus as a great man in communities configured as nations and empires. Rather than looking upon these imaginations as failures, as Schweitzer did, we should consider them as responding to the needs of specific situations and trying to make history relevant for present-day challenges. This is also the challenge for today's images of the historical Jesus, but the specific challenge now is how not to paint Jesus as a nationalist figure. So we see there that Moxnes has given us an incredible overview of everything that he, of all of the ways in which these 19th century figures were based on, or that these 19th century biblical scholars were basing their presentations on Jesus, on the rise of nationalism, and all of these related concepts. And he is going to argue in his final chapter that we have to get beyond it. But the title of his final chapter, chapter 7, is called Jesus Beyond Nationalism, Imagining a Post-National World. And here's where I have actually a pretty large critique of Moxnes and his approach to the historical Jesus in this chapter. Now, he spent, at this point, almost 180 pages deconstructing and breaking down the relationship between nationalism and 19th century historical Jesus scholarship, arguing that it was always limited to the cultural concepts of its time, and to that extent reflects the values of the emerging nationalism in Europe at that time. But I don't believe that Moxnes overcomes this problem himself. So he's absolutely correct that our modern concepts are easily transported back into antiquity, and this is what the work of both Schweitzer and Cadbury demonstrate. Like, just historically, our reconstructions of Jesus are often a reflection of who we are as a person. I think Cadbury has this really great line in his book, and I'm going to butcher it here, but he says something to the effect in his book that we want Jesus to be able to agree with us. And a lot of the times, our historical reconstructions of Jesus are designed to make Jesus affirm all of our modern social and political commitments. And this is really kind of inevitable, right? Like, the categories in which biblical studies and theology are constructed will all inevitably be shaped by modern concerns. I am someone who has been very influenced by postmodernist epistemology, which stipulates that we are all products of our environment and that our knowledge is shaped by our cultural and social context, and that the only way that we can ever minimize that is to be aware of the problem. We cannot step outside of our limited cultural context. I would also say that if you are a proponent of Austrian economics, this is the exact same point as a subjective theory of value and praxeology, and also Friedrich Hayek's critique of centralized planning, that we just don't, human beings aren't capable of having an unlimited capacity for knowledge. And in reality, to bring this full circle, the idea that human beings can step outside of their historical context is a Saint-Simonian idea. It goes back to the early 19th century. So that idea that we have objective knowledge is itself a product of the Enlightenment. And I think it's something that we ought to reject. And it's one of the great things about Moxnes' work in this book is that he shows just how limited the knowledge of these 19th century biblical scholars were. They were contextualized by the rise of nationalism. But Moxnes doesn't do any better in his final chapter. His final chapter, as I said before, is entitled Jesus Beyond Nationalism, and in it, he seeks to use Jesus to deconstruct our modern conception of nationalism. So the last little bit of this book that I'm going to read to you guys it's called specifically, What Would Jesus Deconstruct? And there are a lot of things that he says here that I think are half right. I think that he's grasping at a very important truth, but I think he's taking that truth and he's going in the wrong direction. So here's what he says. He says that it is at this point that I ask with Foucault, and again, Foucault's been very influential to me. I think his idea of genealogy, the idea that, Foucault's concept of genealogy is this concept that stipulates that all ideas are forged within particular social and cultural conditions. and context. And so if you want to understand why somebody believes something, you have to understand the context in which that belief was developed. So I'm with him on that. But Moxnes is going to say, it is at this point I ask with Foucault if it is possible to think otherwise than we have traditionally been thinking. Can writings about Jesus present an alternative form of thinking that can provide ways of imagining societies different from the present world structures based on nation states? I agree with him that they can. Moxnes goes on, this suggestion requires that it is possible to break the picture of Jesus away from its identification with the nation state, and national values that have been part of biblical interpretation since the 19th century. Here I borrow the phrase from John D. Caputo's book, What Would Jesus Deconstruct? This title plays on a very popular with evangelical Christians in America at the end of the 19th century, What Would Jesus Do? This book described what would happen if Jesus returned to a small town in America and imagined how he would represent a challenge of radical social justice. And you can kind of see where I'm going to be going here. From this book came the idea for the title of Caputo's book, An Introduction to Postmodernism in a Church Context. The central piece of Caputo's book is reading of Jesus' radical message of the kingdom of God that literally deconstructs the complacency of modern Christians. They have made family values, the protection of property, and individual freedom central aspects of their reading of the Gospels, and that is what Caputo's presentation of the true Jesus brilliantly deconstructs. Now, there's going to be a problem with this here, and I agree. There are a lot of modern Christians, including libertarians, that think that the Bible supports all of our modern values, and it doesn't. I think that there are plenty of principles there. I've argued this in several places in my podcast. I think that there are several principles in the Bible that we should apply to our understanding of society. It's one of the reasons why I'm a libertarian, why I don't believe in any nation states or any real political entities at all. But we can't, what we're going to do here is that what we're going to see here is that once Moxnes deconstructs these modern concepts, he's only going to replace them with a different set of context or with a different set of ideas that is also borrowed from our modern context. You can't escape this problem. But he's going to go on. These supposedly Christian values are part of what many, not only in America, but also in Europe, perceive to be naturally part of national values. And I take Caputo's question directed at a commonly held Christian view also to be directed at present-day historical Jesus studies, which have been shaped by the naturalness of nations and nationhoods. Thus, I suggest that it is necessary to deconstruct these associations between Jesus and the concerns of the nation and national identities that seem to underlie many presentations of the historical Jesus today. So I propose to raise the same question as Schleiermacher and the other Jesus scholars of the 19th century. What is a people? What are common values? How should an organization of society that serves the good of the people be imagined? However, I suggest raising these questions not in the national key of the 19th century, but as irrelevant for the global context. Thus, I raise the question of how writing about Jesus may be relevant for a vision of a new world order. An obvious question may be why it is necessary to think beyond nationalism. Biographers of Jesus in the 19th century described him in light of the political, social, and economic crises in their society. Together with many others, they saw nationalism as the solution to the political problems of Europe, and this became a dominant pattern of interpretation for 19th century writing. And he's going to go on throughout the rest of this chapter to argue that we need to replace all of those 19th century conceptual categories with 21st century conceptual categories. And this is where this problem really comes full circle. If we are going to agree with the proposition that all research on Jesus is conditioned by the historical context of those that are writing their reconstructions of Jesus, which we all agree with that. I think Moxnes would agree. I agree. We all understand that this is a problem with writing history, is that when we write history or when we study history, we project back an image of our own time and place into history, and we wind up misreading it. It's something that we can't escape. But what Moxnes here is openly proposing is that we replace these 19th century categories with 21st century categories, with the categories of globalism and of critical theory and of leftist political policies, which are kind of the underlying presuppositions. And I don't think that's going to do us any better understanding who Jesus was as a historical figure. And in a lot of ways, it's almost as if Moxnes is insinuating that we ought to be doing the exact same thing that these 19th century biblical scholars did, only we have better categories now. We know better. So our modern 21st century categories will do a better job of articulating the vision of Jesus. And what happens is that while the 19th century scholars of Jesus wound up producing a historical Jesus that affirmed all of their nationalist ideals, Moxnes is going to produce a Jesus that is going to affirm all of his internationalist or globalist ideals. And it's really interesting that when it comes comes to modern biblical scholarship, a lot of historical Jesus research, and this is what James Crossley's next quest for the historical Jesus is in a lot of ways kind of guilty of doing, even though I think it does address a lot of very important questions, and it's very significant that we're explicit in our hermeneutical presentation. It winds up just creating a 21st century version of Jesus, and we wind up missing out on who the 21st or on who the first century version of Jesus was. In fact, it's making it harder and harder for us to get back to the Jesus of history because we're just continuing to substitute real historical inquiry into the life of Jesus with our contemporary categories. Now, as I've said before, this process is unavoidable. Like we can't avoid it. And that's why I've been very, very diligent in my presentation of Jesus on the show to make it explicit that Jesus is not a libertarian. And I'm not going to impose all of my post-Enlightenment libertarian categories back onto the historical Jesus because that's not fair to him. If I do that, I'll always wind up missing what Jesus is actually saying. And this is the problem with if you believe in the authority of the scripture, but you don't realize that your interpretation of the scripture is mediated by categories that come from a different time period, then you're always going to wind up misreading scripture and then subverting it because all you're doing is trying to make your cultural context the authority by which we interpret all of scripture. And that's a really big problem. So here's what I want to end the show on today. I think that as a historical method, the best thing that we can do as thinkers in the 21st century is come to a radical appreciation that all of our knowledge is subjective and all of our knowledge is culturally constructed. When we do that, and then when we go back and read history, we can be aware that we might be imposing our own worldview on history. Now, it's going to happen to a certain degree. All of us are guilty of this. We cannot overcome this problem. It's not possible for us to step outside of our historical context. But the only way that we can minimize the damage that's done by this and try to get back to a reconstruction of Jesus as a historical figure is to be aware of our biases and to try to check them at the door when we're reading the Bible. And it doesn't seem like Moxnes wants to do that. Moxnes wants a Jesus that affirms 21st century progressive globalism because he thinks that is the correct way to approach the historical Jesus, and that in fact Jesus can be used to affirm and support all of those modern positions, and he just can't be. And this is the problem Cadbury points it out in his book. Ludwig von Mises brings this up in some of his work. It's that when we try to employ Jesus to affirm all of our modern social and political sensibilities, we wind up misreading him and misunderstanding who he is. And in reality, Jesus is somebody that's radically different than either me or Moxnes or these 19th century scholars or any theologian or what. He's so much different than we understand. And I think that we have just failed as a church to appreciate the historical gap between the 21st century and the first century. And Moxnes and other writers of Jesus fall into this trap. So while Moxnes does a great job of deconstructing the scholarship of 19th century historical Jesus writers, in 200 years, someone's going to easily be able to come along and do the exact same thing for Moxnes' work, and maybe they'll entitle that one "Jesus and the Rise of Globalism" or something like that. But we're going to be dealing with the exact same problem. So I don't know. I hope that was good for you. I know I got a little ranty there at the end, and I kind of went in a lot of different directions there. But I think that it's really important. And my argument has always been that as a Christian, I believe that I worship Jesus as the Messiah, and I want to understand him for who he truly was in the first century. And I realized that Jesus, as a first century Jew, shared almost no intellectual overlap with my worldview as a 21st century American. And I'm just trying to appreciate that gap and live humbly with the reality that my view of Jesus is colored by my own social and political context. I hope this was interesting for you guys today. When we do deep dives like this, I get some good downloads on them. I don't know if people are listening to the end of the episode, but I really appreciate you if you did listen to the end of this episode. Thank you so much for hanging on with me today. I hope you learned something today. I hope this book was influential. If you love historical Jesus research, I would recommend spending the money and reading this book for yourself because there's a wealth of information in there. And I think that you'll find the majority of it very, very helpful and very elucidating. And then you'll also find a lot to wrestle with as well. And I do appreciate reading people like Moxnes who have a very different worldview than me because it forces me to wrestle with my own ideas and better articulate my own position on these important issues. All right, we're going to leave it there today. Thank you guys so much for listening to another episode of the Protestant Libertarian Podcast, and I will see you guys next Tuesday. Thank you for listening to another episode of the Protestant Libertarian Podcast. If you have any questions or comments, please reach out to me at theprotestantlibertarian@gmail.com. You can also find me on Twitter. You can follow me at the handle @ProLibertyPod. Again, that is @ProLibertyPod. And you can also visit me at theprotestantlibertarianpodcast.com. At theprotestantlibertarianpodcast.com, you can also support the Christians for Liberty Network and the Libertarian Christian Institute. Thank you guys so much for listening to this episode, and we will see you next Tuesday.